Welcome to Parents Perspective with Mike and Amy. My name is Mike Thomas, and with me is my partner in crime prevention, Amy Bishop. Now, this program is part of an education series through the St. Clair County Speak Youth Coalition and is funded in part by Region 10 in partnership with the St. Clair County Health Department and local organizations in the Blue Water area. Over the next 2 weeks, we want to touch on a really touchy subject, address the issue of trauma. For a lot of folks, that's a lot of different things. And oftentimes when we think of trauma, I've thought of like PTSD as it pertains to folks that are in the military. But the truth of the matter is, trauma can take on many different forms and come from many different sources. And it also affects our children, not just in our mental health issues, but in physical as well. And one thing that can lead to is substance use as children try to, or adults, self-medicate or numb their feelings. And so what we wanted to do is bring on a guest speaker. And Amy, would you introduce our guest speaker for us today?
Sure. We are fortunate enough to have Rob Perrin join us today. He's a mental health therapist. So he brings a ton of expertise to this issue. So thanks, Rob, for joining us.
Listen, my pleasure to be here.
So Rob, we have I just want to talk a little bit about your background. So I understand that you worked in a group home for traumatized children during your college years. I guess that's where you kind of gleaned your interest from, because you continued on with that career over the past 20 some years, right?
I did. I did. I worked at the very group home I worked at was also my very first clinician job when I started working for CMH, and I actually had the same room that I used to work with kids in. So it was kind of a full circle moment there, but it was a powerful experience back then.
Can you tell us a little bit currently what you do then?
So I'm a mental health therapist for North Counseling, and I've worked there for the past 23 years. Just kind of doing. I started off a full-time employee, maybe a year or two into my employment there. I received an offer to work for CMH. Tough call because I really loved working for North. So moved over to CMH and I started working in the very group home that I was a staff person and I was a therapist. So kind of just the same situation, but just a different role. But I loved it. It was absolutely my calling, which took me some years to figure out what I was supposed to do in this world. But when I figured it out, I'm so happy I don't have to work for a living because I would suck at it. So I continue to work at North contractually, and I see adults and children there. Here at CMH, I primarily work with children and families. And because I've been here for a while, I usually get some of the more intense, severe cases. But love what I do. Absolutely love what I do.
Well, it definitely sounds like you have a passion for the field. So I'm really thankful that you bring that to our community. So Rob, could you tell us, how would you, I guess, explain to all of us how you would describe trauma?
So listen, trauma, and there's 1,000 different ways to describe it. But what I guess to kind of make it real basic is something happened. Something happened to an individual, a child, in our case, more children, just because of what we do. And the child doesn't know what to do with it. It's an experience or a situation that causes, the fear of survival, a terror, helplessness, and it can be towards fear of survival of self or loved ones. And because of that, the brain cannot assimilate the memory into the existing, what it knows about the world. So it gets stuck in the brain. There's an intense emotion connected to it. We all have our memories of what happened to us intellectually, right? We could tell the story of this happened to me. You throw in intense emotion and it sticks, right? And that can be a good thing. If it's a birthday party or something wonderful, you think, oh, that's a great emotion and it feels great to have that memory. But for trauma, it's a destructive emotion that can shape, and it can kind of modify how we feel about the world and just how we see the world and how we see trust and so many other factors that help us, have successful relationships with others. So to kind of nutshell that, I guess it's something really bad happened and our brain doesn't know what to do with it. And so it kind of hangs around as a survival strategy. Our brain doesn't let it forget because it wants to make sure we're gonna survive going forward.
You froze up a little bit there on the very beginning of what you defined trauma as. We got the end part of it. how that emotion can impact memory and such. But could you just repeat the very first few phrases maybe you said? I'm sorry.
And that's okay. That's okay. So something, it's very scary, I mean, it can be something very terrifying, something that sends a message to your brain that your survival is not guaranteed going forward, right? And it can be for yourself or for a loved one. So the brain takes that emotion in very intensely, because at the core of it all, our brain's primary job, especially subconscious and our primal functioning, is to survive. So I take a child for an example, and they're kind of living their life, and they kind of have a general idea about what the world's about, and then something happens, traumatic, and it doesn't fit with what they know about the world. And so all of a sudden, they don't know what to do with that memory. So it doesn't assimilate with kind of what I know. So it's kind of free floating, and it's just part of our everyday living. And every day, the child's either reliving it or they're trying to suppress it, and that traumatic memory to kind of deal with life. So something really scary happened, and our brain doesn't know how to process it and make sense of it. It's kind of the gist of the definition of trauma in our world.
Well, thanks. Could you explain or give examples of some of those things that could cause trauma that can happen in people's lives, especially in early childhood?
Sure. So, and then we don't deal with a lot of single event, like more acute traumas. It can be a car accident, it could be a natural disaster, it could be watching a loved one die, domestic violence, it could be physical abuse or sexual abuse. It could be kind of a one-time event, and absolutely still can play a major role in development, and absolutely kind of kidnap the child's ability to kind of continue to develop in the typical manner. We do, at CMH, we deal a lot more with complex or chronic trauma, where it's kind of an ongoing lifestyle, where they're re-experiencing trauma often, where they're kind of, just the life they live. They're seeing traumatic events, or they're having traumatic experiences, quite often. And those, much more complicated to deal with on a treatment end, as far as caregiving, much more challenging to deal with from that end also.
So Rob, you mentioned a lot about the brain and how a child's thought process take that all in. When we're dealing with specifically like immediate effects of trauma, what were some of the physical and mental effects that you see right off the bat that happen immediately after a child endures any type of trauma?
So as far as the physical end, so if we think about it, right, it's a development, it kind of kidnaps, it's almost like a brain injury. Now, people can heal from it, and it doesn't have to be a permanent situation, but child's going through their developmental course, and all of a sudden something happens. So the brain kind of kicks out of thrive mode or developmental mode, and it kind of goes into survival mode. And that absolutely impairs the child's ability to continue to do the things, developmental tasks, things you would think a child would continue to do. Those things often kind of take a back seat, because survival is always king. It rules the day. So they oftentimes, you'll see they're hypervigilant, their anxiety spikes, they're avoidant, they just really are uncomfortable in certain situations. It certainly can lead to panic attacks. Their amygdala, the part of our brain that's kind of our fight or flight mode, is become very active, and it kind of, we'll see a lot more brain activity in the amygdala than we typically would for kids who are traumatized. And our amygdala is great. If we're going to get attacked by a bear, I want my amygdala online. I want it there for me. But when I'm trying to sit in a classroom and learn, our amygdala, there's research out there, we're functioning about 30 points lower in our IQ. So a child goes into a school classroom or wherever, and they're basically functioning with an impairment, and hypervigilant and hyper alert of any potential risk or dangers. So it absolutely can affect so many parts to it. If you look at it affects your development, then it can affect almost any other area of kind of physical or mental. Also, again, it can change belief systems, right? So if something happens to you traumatic, you get a message about the world, especially for young children. Like, this happened. I didn't know this could happen. What does that mean about people who are supposed to take care of me? What does it mean about, my future? What does it mean about safety, trust, all of those things? So it can kind of reshape. And this is where I see trauma really, really becoming, it can hijack us for children, and they just get stuck there because it really reshapes how they see the world, and that transfers. And if we don't correct that over time by providing the appropriate treatment supports, then that'll sting, and that'll affect them longer term than the actual physical trauma component.
So what would be some of the long-term effects? And like, if we're looking at relationships, if we're looking at how we process things, like sometimes like fear that just really manifests, like what could be some potential long-term effects for dealing with an early on traumatic experience as a child?
So if we look at it this way, so if your child goes through an experience early on, and it was traumatic, right? Their amygdalas have become overactive. Their emotions have got clouded, right? So they're functioning from more of the primal part of their brain more often. Certain events in lives where maybe it would cause the average child or average person, an increase in stress, but manageable. For kids who go through trauma, because of the amygdala is so active, because it had to be on a survival measure, it will it'll send us into a tailspin. You'll see more tantrums. You'll see more dysregulation. And if you look at how that plays out in school, well, school is going to be very difficult for many of these kids. They're not functioning out of their smart brain. They're not functioning in their emotional controls. So they'll have a lot of behavior problems, oftentimes social rejections. They often won't feel like they fit in. They'll oftentimes bring more feedback from their parents that's not real positive, right? Because they require a lot of attention, of discipline and consequence. So all of that can kind of reshape how they feel about themselves and just their overall self-esteem and confidence. So transfer that years forward, depression, anxiety, ADHD symptoms, even though it may not be true ADHD, the anxious mind looks very ADHD-ish, and they really struggle with if there's any other mental health issues. PTSD can be a kind of an intensifier. So if you have challenges with focus or you have challenges with depression and you throw PTSD on top of it, it's going to complicate it further, and it's just going to make it much more difficult to manage those symptoms. So, long-term effects, really, the list is never ending as far as if it's not treated.
Okay.
Well, thanks. That did explain a lot. It really spoke to me how you said, a child can go into a classroom, and if they have this trauma going on, that can even reduce their IQ momentarily on what they are able to actually absorb and how they're able to function educationally in the school, not to mention socially and so on. So sure, that huge impacts. One question I think a lot of parents talk about, or it's kind of heard of or discussed is, a lot of parents still stick with, especially when there's huge behavioral issues. Well, the only way I can control them is to spank my child or use corporal punishment. Or they go back historically and say, well, it worked for me, so why wouldn't we continue to do that? And then that, old saying that's, in the Bible, spare the rod, spoil the child. So what can you give us any insight into that, on how that may impact an already traumatized child?
You mean as far as physical punishment goes and corporal punishment and kind of how it plays out? I'm not a big proponent of it. I certainly don't want to, there's people who believe that can be an appropriate punishment, and if done the right way, then it certainly could have its place in some situations. I would say for children who are traumatized, it should be, very, very, should have a lot of thought put into it before we ever go there. Traumatized kids, like physical touch, for many of these kids, it's a completely different experience for them, right? So, ultimately, what the goal of any punishment is, right, to teach the child that, listen, these behaviors are not okay, and we're going to hold you accountable. And that's great. That's what good parents do. They want to teach their children, you can't do these things, and when you do, this is what happens. But with that in mind, if you take a child who's traumatized, especially if there's physical abuse or any kind of sexual abuse or anything that involved touch, or they can kind of complicate that experience for them, as soon as we lay our hands on them, we're no longer, for the child, it's no longer necessarily a learning moment, because again, if we're going to go back to the brain, as soon as we touch them, they have been activated with their trauma. They're back in their emotional brain, their primal brain, they're in their survival brain. And bottom line is that is not where children learn. Okay, they don't learn from that part of their brain. Now, what they might learn is mom or dad or caregiver is mad at me. They can hit me, and they can spank me, but then it becomes more emotional and more about the relationship, and not about the teaching. They're not going to learn the lesson because their smart brain is not online at that moment. And for some kids, they can really regress and they can become aggressive because they're kind of going into, I'm going to defend myself. And then you're creating a dynamic in the relationship between parent and child that become very destructive and very overwhelming. So I guess in the end, it is not preferred. I really, really discourage it. I try to meet parents where they're at and work with it, but it is seldom is it a best course of action. And really, when parents spank or they use physical punishment, it's often emotional based parenting, right? So because we're frustrated, right? And we don't know what else to do. And we've tried to talk to them. We've tried to use our words. So we defer to, I'm going to spank them. And the frustrations, again, if our emotions are at that intense level and we're spanking them, that can feel abusive. Even if it's not intended to from the parent, it can feel abusive because I'm angry at you. And this is what I do when I'm angry. And that is not the lesson we want to teach our children. If I'm angry and I'm using aggression to solve a problem, well, if we take that message and we transfer it to the child and they use that when they get older, which oftentimes does happen, we got a problem. So I think we got to be very mindful of using any kind of physical punishment. There's other strategies to hold them accountable. I'm all about accountability. I'm all about, because that is part of love. That is part of teaching our children the right way, but we got to be very careful about going down the physical punishment road.
Thanks, Rob. I really like how you explained that. That really made a lot of sense. And honestly, when we were thinking about these questions, and this was one of them I wanted you to answer, I did a little homework and I looked up, where that biblical statement was, and then what it meant historically. And if you look into it, the rod was used with shepherds. Shepherds would use the rod to guide their sheep and to help them prevent them from or correct them from falling off cliffs and so on. So it was more of a guidance tool than rather it wasn't a whipping stitch. So I really like what you said. You're right. To be in the learning mode, that's what we really want out of
for sure
correction and reflection and inflection in that. So that's a great way to describe it. So the other thing is, lots of times words can hurt. You've heard that more so. And when we look at different parenting styles, I just am curious if there are certain parenting styles that more likely may lead to trauma as an impact.
There is, and I want to really normalize this because it is so easy to parent, or it's so easy to give advice from the therapist chair. And tell them, hey, listen, do this. And, hey, listen, it's, and when I was younger, I probably was guilty of that way too often. Like, hey, just do these things, right? Until you walk in their shoes, and it's a real challenge. So I don't want any of this to come across as condescending or judgmental in any way, because it is a grind. And I have, 3 kids myself, 2 teenage daughters. So pray for me. That is a real challenge all the time. So, and I'm way better at being a therapist sometimes than I am about parenting my own kids. So that's a real thing there. But we have to be very careful. Like our words are so powerful, and in many ways they can be more long lasting. A physical punishment can be a one-time event, and it can its shelf life can kind of be shorter, and kids can heal from that sometimes quicker. But as we communicate with our kids with our words, what we tell them when they're young, and a lot of the a lot of the programming as far as the running track, what the research will tell you is kind of 0 to 7. Kids are kind of on almost subconscious mode where they're a sponge. They're taking in so much. They're learning how to walk. They're learning how to talk, eat. I mean, the brain is on overload of taking information in. And part of what it's taking in is, who am I? What's my self-worth? How do I fit in? If kids have behavior problems, a lot of times what they're taking in is there's something wrong with them. And their parents are frustrated with them. And again, normal human parenting, sometimes we get down on our kids and we may say things to them that we regret later. But those messages, what we are telling our kids when they're at that age, often becomes their running narrative as they get older. Their self-talk and what they think of themselves was kind of shaped by what they heard early on. And if you take a kid who's been programmed to devalue who they are and think of themselves as less than, and you put that into their teenage years, especially with the teenage depression is already on the rise, you're pretty much guaranteeing with those 2 components in place, you're going to deal with some emotional issues and probably some clinical depression. So we got to be real careful. Words are extremely powerful. So we got to be mindful of what are we telling our child. Can we hold them accountable without being destructive with our words? And that really is the challenge. and to not get too wrapped up in, I'm frustrated with you, so I'm kind of going to say some things that maybe are more about my frustration than they are about you learning a lesson or your growth. Did that answer your full question? I don't know if there was another part to that.
Just on parenting styles. So, I mean, I
Right.
definitely am hearing what you're saying.
Mhm.
We all need to, at times as parents, you know, think about, is this coming from my feelings? Am I just venting this out? Not,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
not being
So
helpful.
absolutely, absolutely. And again, knowing full well that we're all human, so we're all going to mess it up at times, but we really want to really avoid reactive parenting. We all listen in today's world, you know, so many situations, parents are working too much, two parents working, and you're just kind of taxed, right? And then you got to be running your kids around. It's easy to get overwhelmed. But reactive parenting, meaning you parent more based out of your emotion, or just based on just frustration. Volume, like if you're going to talk to your child, your volume and your tone are so critical, and they can serve as triggers. If your child's been traumatized, volume, because anytime a child's triggered, they have certain sensory reminders, right? So what was going on when I went through the trauma? It might be volume, it might be a smell, it might be something they see, but there's a lot of things that will activate that traumatic experience. And if we do that, that is not the time we're going to try to teach our child. We're just going to try to support them through that moment to get them to a better place so we can have productive conversations with them. But reactive parenting, you know, screaming, yelling, hollering, again, we all have our moments, but that is seldom a good plan for a child who goes through trauma. It also doesn't role model how to communicate intense emotion. And for traumatized kids, because their emotions have been dysregulated, because their amygdala has been trained to be too active and a bigger part of their life than we want it, they don't regulate emotion well, and they need to learn how to do that. And the best way to teach that is by showing examples on how to manage that. So I think we got to be very careful about being proactive in our parenting, being kind and supportive. You know, again, holding them accountable. And I think I touched on this later, but like as far as when we're correcting our children, don't get too wordy. Don't use too many words. We don't want our kids to associate our voice with when mom talks or dad talks or caregiver talks. It's going to be a lecture, and they're going to tell me that I kind of suck, right? And if that's what they kind of get used to, the running narrative is that's what they usually say when they talk to me. Kids will learn to kind of tune you out. They also will have, and this is kind of some brain research. They'll have a little change in brain chemistry because the sound of your voice will become a trigger of cortisol and adrenaline will be increased in the brain because they're preparing for battle. Because mom or dad's talking to me right now, and I've had enough conditioned responses in the past to know this ain't going to go well. So so you could walk in the room and say hello. If you've done this in enough battles, you can walk in the room and say hello, and the child's already going to be in battle mode because that dynamic has not been constructive. So use our words very carefully when we're correcting them. Very concise. Let the consequence serve the communication. Just you didn't do this. This is what I need you to do. End of story. Now, if you can catch them, praise the heck out of them. Use your voice just to praise them. Ask them how their day's going. That's when they talk, or when you talk, that should be what they expect to come out of your voice. Is those kind of communications. More often, we want to balance that scale on the heavy end of the positive side.
Wow, that hit home for me.
Yeah, me too.
Voice, I want my voice to be heard as a positive and comforting thing, not a negative nagging, I'm tuning out of this. That's a great point. Thanks for sharing that.
And Rob, I'm glad that you're bringing up, like, there's some significant generational gaps in like how we have raised children in the past versus now. And so one last question kind of tying in with that as well too. A lot of people right now are thinking, because COVID's going on, and there's a variety of different thoughts with that maybe sometimes we're being a little bit too soft on youth, and like we're using some things too much as an excuse. But COVID's changed the way how we do school and how we do things at home quite substantially. And so is it possible that those changes are causing any type of trauma in children, or are we really just being too soft when we say things like that?
Listen, I'm glad I'm kind of old school. I don't like I coach my kids. I got a kind of a tough old school mentality with some of that stuff. As far as sports world goes and so forth. But as far as emotional health and the pandemic and all the things go along with that, Mike, I will say I absolutely think we need to be soft. I think it's a necessity on the sense of, I mean, let's think about this. So here's what early research is showing. It's showing that there's an increase in domestic violence. There's an increase in substance use of parents. There's an increase in divorce. There's an increase in physical abuse. There's an increase in depression. I mean, this pandemic kind of sucks. I know that's not breaking news to anybody, but I thought I'd just make sure that we confirm that, okay? And it has changed people's lives in a dramatic way. As far as kids, like what their main job is to go to school, right? To go to school and to make friends, and that's their job, right? And all of a sudden, all the rules of engagement have been flipped on its script, and it's completely backwards and different in a way we've never seen. I work with a lot of kids who are straight A students, and have just done so well academically, and it was part of their self-esteem and their self-identity. And then it goes online, right? And it changed how they do it, and they didn't do as well, and they struggled, and it was just, boy, it was a gut punch for a lot of them as far as how they felt about themselves, and then on top of their parents are fighting more, because listen, a whole bunch of together time during this COVID, which is wonderful on some levels, but you know what, we all need balance in life, and if we spend too much time with anybody or most people, we're going to rub each other. We're going to, create those things, and honestly, just parents, losing jobs and financial stresses. Parents are going to, back to the kind of the parenting styles, you become more reactive, right? You have less balance, and you just feel less good about your life. So that is going to impair your ability to have some tolerance and patience and open communication with your child, because you're just not at a good place. So I think all of those things play a role. And I just think that what I've seen is an uptick in depression and anxiety with so much of our population here. And I think we need to be as supportive as we can. They've lost social time. They've lost, sports a lot of times is kind of a wonderful outlet. The gyms were closed. So a lot of the coping skills that kids use to kind of manage stress kind of gone, right? Kind of gone. It's even spending time together for the longest time was not an option. Not to mention increased inside time, not the best plan as far as kind of managing stress and anxiety, right? So all these other things, and then you throw in the fact some of the things we do to cope are kind of limited. Now we're inside way more, we're on our screen way more, and I could go on and on about screen time and probably would take up too much show time here, but screen time is kind of the devil, and it's a necessity, and it's amazing, and technology is just wonderful, but oh my goodness, screen time in teenagers, I've never seen a session now where I actually have to have kids like, hey, can you put your phone down? Or should we just text each other during this session, right? So it is what it is, and it's just, listen, when I was a kid and I had this handheld computer in my hand, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. I'd probably have the same issue. So it isn't going to be kid driven. It's going to have to be parent driven about setting limits on things and kind of, and screen time. I'll let it go at this because I don't want to get too wrapped up in going on in this, but part of happiness and joy and managing stress, is pleasure, right? And dopamine and serotonin are two of our biggest neurotransmitters that allow us to enjoy life. Well, screen time, it absolutely can overtax those systems, especially the dopamine center, where we're getting too much. It's like video game, a success, or Facebook, a like, and our dopamine is getting depleted. It's getting overtaxed. So then we try to do something regular in life, right? Something we normally would find joyful, and we're not getting the same dopamine releases. Our brain's not going through the same processes. So we're not finding satisfaction and joy in life experiences, real life experiences. Well, what is that going to do? Well, you start to take meaning from that of my life sucks. I can't even enjoy this. And so it spirals into more depression. So I encourage all parents to set some limits on screen time, to really, really watch it. And then honestly, just to make sure what your kids are doing online. Our jobs are not to trust our kids. Our jobs are to raise our kids effectively, because there's too many freedoms out there right now, too many temptations. And if they don't have an external control of somebody's watching over them, that's a lot to put on a kid. It's a lot to put on a kid. So I think they need to know mom and dad or whoever's caring for them is paying attention. So, all right, I'm off my high horse on that one. That's enough on the screen time, but yes.
Rob, we really appreciate your time, and it's all the time we have left for this episode. So what we're going to ask you folks to do is tune in next week. Rob's going to actually help us understand some ways that parents can help our children cope, and also maybe some ways we can prevent some of the stuff from happening as well too. So if you would, please stay tuned. We'll be on next week, Wednesday at 6:00. As always, if you have any questions, we'd love to get some comments from you. Go ahead and leave some questions, comments in the comment section below. And don't forget, we also have some other programs that are out there. We do Instagram activities as well as February 24th. We're going to be actually doing a trivia night for youth as well too. So fun things that are going on. But again, Rob, I want to thank you very much for coming on. And we're going to be happy to have you on our next segment to kind of share some of these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you.